Part 2, Man of the House, 1780. Chapter 5, The Beast, May 1st, 1780. It will be dark in an hour, Basil thought. He sighed. I shall have to head for home soon. The impatient 15-year-old muttered out loud, Another wasted afternoon. He heard a twig snap somewhere to his left. His heart skipped a beat. Billingsley, he scolded himself mentally. You just spooked a deer. At least he hoped that it was a deer. A fat, tasty doe would be a great blessing indeed for his family. And how proud he would be to bring such a prize home to his mother. Basil, lounging lazily against the trunk of a small oak tree, sat upright and raised his Pennsylvania fowling gun to the ready. The old flintlock was loaded with a round ball and 4 smaller pieces of buckshot, plenty of lead to bring down a deer critter. He listened carefully and tried to control his breathing. His heart thumped loudly in his chest. He continued to scan the trail to his left that led to the nearby salt lick. It was a popular place for the local does to visit in the late afternoon. After several silent, still minutes, he shook his head, disappointed, and gave up. Again, he slumped back against the soft, cool moss that coated the base of the tree. The Billingsleys needed fresh meat. They were not starving or desperate by any means, but their winter stores were beginning to run low. The potatoes and pumpkins were all consumed by mid-February. Precious few of the dried vegetables and jarred fruits remained. The various patriot militias that roamed the forests and fields of Guilford and Randolph counties had purchased and confiscated a large portion of their cows and hogs. At least their chickens and egg supplies were sufficient, if not ample. But Basil was growing weary of eating chicken and eggs. Lately, the most common addition to their diet was mushrooms foraged from the forest floor, and Basil hated mushrooms. He positively gagged at the salads that his mother made from the leaves and flowers of the dandelions that grew in nearby pastures. Their Quaker neighbors had recently introduced his mother to their strange new food source. His older brothers helped their mother as much as they could, but they were having difficulty providing for the needs of their own families. Besides, Basil really did not want their help. He was the man of the house now, and he took very seriously his responsibility to provide for his mother and sister Martha. It was a matter of personal pride for the scrappy youth. If they could just hold out a bit longer, there would be plenty of food in a few months. That was certain. Due to the hard work of Basil's mother and sister, the family gardens were progressing nicely. Still, it would be a few weeks before the tomatoes, squashes, and cucumbers would begin to bear. Beans would not be ready until July. Their apple, pear, plum, and peach orchards would not begin to produce fruit until early August. And it would be September before Basil's older brothers would reap a harvest of potatoes, wheat, and corn from the rich fields of the Billingsley farmland. But the promise of plenty at summer's end did precious little to quell the hunger that the Billingsley would suffer in the days and weeks to come. Basil needed to bring home some fresh game for the table. The occasional rabbit, turkey, or squirrel was helpful, but he really wanted to impress his mother and sister. He wanted big game. He dreamed of shooting a deer, or even better, an elk. Surely a generous supply of meat for the drying rack and smokehouse would do much to raise spirits at home. It would also show Basil's mother that he truly was a man and quite capable of providing for the needs of their household. The 4 years that had passed since that faithful, deadly Tory raid on their home had been the difficult ones for the Billingsleys. The rebellion against England had cost their family dearly. James Billingsley had been slain during that horrible raid. Henry Billingsley was permanently crippled, his leg crushed by his fallen horse. Walter was gravely injured and required almost a year to recover from his wounds. Yet the events of that horrible night were only the beginning. The American Revolution continuously impacted Elizabeth Billingsley and her sons and daughters throughout the next 4 years. The widowed Elizabeth had watched helplessly as her 3 oldest sons marched off to war. Samuel, James, and John all served in the Great Cherokee Campaign of the autumn of 1776. Walter, though he had desperately wanted to go to serve with his brothers, needed his mother's demands and remained at home in her care. Basil was glad that he had remained um, at home in her care. Basil was glad that he had stayed home despite their regular arguments and spats. Walter was his closest brother and very best friend. He loved him dearly. After returning home from the Cherokee campaign, each of the older brothers served several 3-month enlistments in their local militia regiments. Though there had been no actual British to fight, there was a constant threat from British loyalists, the Tories. Small groups from South Carolina and eastern North Carolina occasionally made raids into the Piedmont. It seemed that one of the Billingsley boys was always away on militia duty, either on cavalry patrol, guarding Tory prisoners, or escorting supply convoys through the region. Walter relentlessly continued to pester his mother about militia service, but all of that changed on an autumn afternoon in 1778. That was when Abigail Hamer entered Walter's life. The young maiden was a young maiden from South Carolina, visiting in the home of a Billingsley relative, had completely upended Walter's world. The young couple fell helplessly, hopelessly in love. After only 1 week of courtship, the love-struck pair was already making marriage plans. They simply had to wait a few years for Walter to reach legal marrying age. Meanwhile, they nurtured their all-consuming romance by writing endless letters. Walter also managed to find ways to visit Abigail from time to time at her hometown of Camden, South Carolina. But Walter, now 18 years of age, was the most recent of the Billingsley boys to travel into harm's way. He departed 10 days prior for Camden, South Carolina, but not to go to war. He was there to fetch his beautiful fiancée, Abigail, to the relative safety of North Carolina. The British had recently landed their army at Charlestown, and were threatening to break out of the ring of Continental Army soldiers that surrounded the city. Once their dragoons were on the loose, Camden would surely be one of their targets. Walter was not taking any chances. He simply had to go and get his beloved Abigail and bring her home. He had to protect his future bride. Walter did not feel that he could wait any longer. His plan was simple. He would bring Abigail back to Guilford County. They would be wed immediately, and then they would live in a newly constructed cottage on the Billingsley farm. Walter had been working on the house for over a year with help from Basil and the other brothers. It was a charming little cottage and almost complete. Basil smiled as he remembered watching Walter and his clownish friend, Gabrielle Tate, riding off in the family wagon on the road toward Salisbury. They were certain to have a great adventure. He was happy for his brother and a bit envious. He was also a bit sad about the notion of his brother leaving home and moving to his own house on the family farm. Basil suddenly felt a wave of loneliness wash across his soul. He could not even remember any of his other brothers living at home with him. They were all wed when Basil was very young. Indeed, Samuel had been married before Basil was even born. But Walter had always been there for him. The two of them had grown up together. Even though they fussed and fought constantly, they had always been inseparable. Basil's heart ached at the thought of sleeping alone in a room with 3 empty beds in it. Surely the coming years would be filled with many lonely days and nights. A strange pungent odor invaded Basil's nostrils and snatched him away from his wandering thoughts. The leaves near his house rustled, evidence of the breeze that had carried the unpleasant smell. The odor was strong and musky. It was not the smell of death or rot. It reminded Basil of his old billy goat that he had played with as a young child. What in heaven's name is that smell? He wondered. Suddenly the forest grew very quiet. The birds had filled the canopies of trees that filled the canopy of trees had ceased their cheerful chirping songs. Squirrels no longer frolicked, jumped, or chattered. There were no sounds of life at all. The only thing that remained was the dull rustle of limbs and leaves swaying in the breeze high overhead. The hair on Basil's neck stood on end. A shiver of fear and uncertainty tickled across his back. Then it seemed even the wind stopped blowing. There was absolute, Dead silence. "What's going on?" whispered Basil, confused. "This is most strange." The silence of the forest was shattered by a loud grunt immediately behind Basil's hiding place. Then the bushes behind him began to shake. The rank odor became overwhelming. He spun to his left to discover the source of the noise and the smell. The sight that greeted him almost made his heart stop. He was staring directly into the face of a bear. The beast's snout was barely a foot away from Basil's own nose. The animal did not seem to be disturbed at the sight of a human. Indeed, if anything, it was curious. It inhaled deeply, sniffing the boy's head. It snorted playfully, hurling a mist of moist air and snot into Basil's face. Basil reacted to the animal out of shock and fear. Though the bear showed no signs of aggression or attack, the frightened boy instinctively jerked away and swung the stock of his Fowler gun upward. The weapon struck the bear soundly in the chin. It was a well-aimed, vicious blow. The hard brass of the butt plate impacted a tooth that protruded from the bear's upper lip. There was a loud cracking sound. The shattered tooth flew from the animal's mouth and bounced off of the tree. Basil fell backwards. The bear was stunned for a moment. It shook its head in confusion. Droplets of blood leaked from its wounded mouth. Immediately, the bear abandoned its curious, harmless sniffing. It rose high on its haunches and growled in pain and anger. It lunged ferociously at Basil. Its claws dug deeply into the small tree against which he had been resting. Chunks of dislodged bark and dust rained down on the frightened boy. The bear shook the tree violently, dislodging leaves, dust, pollen, and insects from its canopy. The falling debris added to Basil's terror and confusion. Basil was petrified with fear. Black bears were still relatively calm in the forests and mountains of western North Carolina. However, hunters and settlers did not encounter them very often in Guilford County. John Billingsley shot a bear several years ago on the family farm. Basil remembered that event very well because it was such a rarity in the Piedmont region. Basil had never even seen a bear in the wild, much less had a personal encounter with one. Suddenly, Basil remembered the gun in his hands. He pushed himself backward away from the bear and attempted to aim the weapon at the wailing, growling animal. The bear sensed his aggression, dropped onto all four of its legs, and slapped angrily at the gun barrel. Its claws scarred the wood and jarred the gun loose from Basil's hand. It slammed against the tree and fell to the ground. The beast gave a mighty, angry roar, spraying Basil with a mixture of foul saliva and blood. Once again, the bear rose up onto its hind legs and shook the nearby tree and bushes. It was in pain and making every attempt to frighten away the curious-looking, pale human that had caused its discomfort. It did not appear that it wanted to fight. It was merely making a show of force and making a lot of noise. The bear lifted its head upward and roared at the tree tops as it continued to shake the foliage. Basil took advantage of the bear's change of posture and lapse in attention. Though he was lying flat on his back, he reached to his left and grabbed his gun from the ground. He pulled the hammer back to full cock and thrust the barrel toward the bear. At that exact moment, the raging beast once again dropped down on all four legs and took a step through the bushes toward Basil. It opened its mouth and emitted another thunderous roar. The horrified boy thrust the barrel of the flintlock deep into the bear's open mouth and instantly pulled the trigger. The sound of the explosion was deafening. The gunpowder pan of the weapon was just below Basil's chin. The explosive powder blew a cloud of fire and smoke upward into his face. He could feel the scorch of sparks against his chin and cheeks. He turned his head, gagged and coughed, attempted to coax a breath of fresh air from outside the cloud of bitter smoke. His ears were ringing loudly. Something very heavy was pinning his legs to the ground. Basil realized that flames were coming from the sleeves of his hunting frock on his right arm. He released the gun and slapped at the fire with his left hand, extinguishing the flames quickly. It took a couple seconds for the smoke to clear. A slight breeze scattered the smoke just enough for him to catch a glimpse of the bear. Basil stared toward his legs and feet in disbelief. The beast lay still. It was belly down with its chest on top of Basil's legs. The animal's bloody snout was just above his crotch. The gun barrel hung loosely from its silent mouth. The bear was dead. Basil was alive. The boy's body shook from fear. He threw his burned, smoky forearm over his head, sucked in a heaving breath, and cried. Samuel and John Billingsley stared at the carcass of the bear. Basil stood proudly beside the animal, his gun cradled lazily in the crook of his left arm. Both men cast a somewhat incredulous glance at their little brother. "And the critter fell on you when you shot it?" questioned Samuel in disbelief, pointing at Basil's bloody breeches. Basil nodded. He did not feel much like talking. He was tired, having run all the way to Samuel's house to tell him about his kill. "You let it get that close to you before you shot it?" John asked. Basil's head hung a bit low. "I never even heard the bear until it stuck its head into the thicket where I was hiding." "Were you asleep, little bear?" challenged John. "No," Basil answered emphatically. "I was not asleep. What were you doing then that would so occupy your mind that you could not hear a 400-pound bear walk up to you?" Basil shrugged his shoulders. "I was thinking, I suppose." "Thinking?" challenged Samuel, almost shouting. "About what?" "Oh, I do not know. About Walter mostly. About him getting married and moving out of the house and me being left there alone with two women." Samuel chuckled. There's a lot worse places to be in this world than at home, snug and safe with mother. I can assure you of that." John grunted and nodded in agreement. Samuel continued, "But I can see how such change could be troubling to you. Change can do that to a man. But you cannot let change or your fear of it defeat you, Basil. Do you understand? You have to keep your mind focused on what is truly important and just keep on moving forward." John grinned. "Then, one of these days soon, you shall be wedded and moving out on your own, just like Walter." Basil blushed, embarrassed, and covered his hand with his mouth. "Anyhow, you have other things to worry about right now, little brother," encouraged Samuel. "You have killed yourself a fine big bear. Now we have some work to do. We have to get this huge beast back to mother's barn, skin it, trim the fat for rendering, and butcher the meat. I will wager that there are over 200 pounds of fine meat on that critter, maybe another 20 or 30 beyond that." John walked over to put his arms around Basil's shoulders. "But do not worry, Basil. We shall help you clean it and eat it." He grinned warmly at the tired boy. "Indeed," chirped Samuel. "We must get word to our brothers and their families. We shall gather the entire Billingsley clan this night. It will be a feast of roast bear, courtesy of our little brother Basil."